Welcome back to the Der Show. Before we get to the tragic New York shooting, in which so many innocent people were killed, I just want to touch on two items of today's news. Obviously, as expected, Ghislaine Maxwell said if she's subpoenaed to testify in front of Congress, she has to get immunity. Of course she does. She has a Fifth Amendment privilege. Now, people are confused because they say, well, she's already spoken to the Department of Justice, to Emil Bowe, and hasn't she waived it? No. She was given what's called Queen for a Day immunity when she spoke there. And so that doesn't waive her Fifth Amendment rights. She still has the right to refuse to testify in front of Congress, even if she's just asked the question, what did you say to the Department of Justice? Because the Department of Justice can't use anything that she said in this hearing, in this meeting that they had in Florida. But if she testifies in front of Congress without immunity, they could use that to prosecute her. So she has the right to take the Fifth, and any decent lawyer would have her take the Fifth. And ultimately, in the end, Congress will almost certainly give her immunity. The problem has become so political, and so congressmen don't want to vote for anything that looks like it favors Jeffrey Epstein or Jeffrey Epstein's co-conspirators. So we may have a few little problems, but ultimately, I think she'll testify. I don't think she's going to find any smoking guns, and of course, in her testimony, she's not only going to be asked name names, who went to the island, or she's going to be asked for proof. She's going to be asked, do you have records? And she has records. I don't know whether she's kept them or where she has them. But she obviously, I saw her making reservations for me to fly back from Palm Beach, where I met with prosecutors, back to Boston. And, there are physical records. And those might be quite revealing depending on who they are, what dates there are. For example, President Trump said that Bill Clinton was on the island 17 times. He denies having ever been on the island. And one of his assistants said, well, I think maybe he was on the island once, and then kind of pulled back on that. So we don't know what the situation is. Very unlikely that Bill Clinton was on the island on multiple occasions. But if there are records, the records would show it. You can't get to the island without leaving a record. You certainly can't get to the island if you're the former president of the United States without leaving a record, because there are no direct flights to the island, and there are no helicopters that fly you directly to the island. You have to fly commercially, or you have to fly in a private plane, but land and have a record made of the date, the time, and the depending on where he came from, customs search. Obviously, the island is part of the United States, and so there wasn't necessarily a customs search depending on where the plane came from. But I think in the end, we're going to see immunity, we're going to see testimony, and we're just not going to see all that much. The other piece of news, this is just a stupid thing. Great Britain says it might recognize a Palestinian state. What does that mean? That it's going to recognize Hamas? Hamas has already been declared by Great Britain to be a terrorist organization. And we know that if there were an open and fair election in what is called Palestine, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, we know who would win that election. It would be Gaza. The last time there was an election anywhere in what is called Palestine, Gaza won, Hamas won overwhelmingly. So what Great Britain is saying, and France has said, is that it's going to recognize a Hamas state. And you think that's going to help a two-state solution? Do you think Israel is ever going to make peace and create a two-state solution with a group of people like Hamas, who came over the border and murdered so many of their people, raped their children, beheaded people, put them in ovens, shot women in front of their children in front of their mothers? Do you really think that you're recognizing a Palestinian state, which would be headed by Hamas, contributes to peace? No, it may make you feel good, but it's the most absurd, empty, kind of righteous claim, virtue posting, nothing to do with reality. You want to help reality? offer to bring, 1,000 Palestinian children to England to live there and to get medical care. All right, do that. France, do that. No, France has accepted one person who was the cover person, and I think it was the Times, where they showed a picture of somebody who they said was starving. It turned out he wasn't starving. He had a very serious genetic illness, and now he's being treated apparently in France. So as we said yesterday, the people of Gaza and Hamas have cried wolf once too often. And so people really are very skeptical of this claim. If you hate Israel, you're not skeptical of the claim. You're going to believe anything. And as I've said yesterday too, anybody who uses the term genocide to describe what's happening in Gaza cannot be trusted to say anything accurately. They destroy their credibility completely when they use the term genocide, because what Israel is doing is the furthest thing from genocide, much further from genocide than what Great Britain did in the Second World War, what the United States did in the Second World War, and what every country has done since. So let's stop playing with words and let's stop throwing accusations. Let's try to do something. Get the hostages back. Make Hamas give up its arms. The easiest thing, the way to stop any kind of hunger, whether it's serious or not serious, is for Hamas to give back the hostages. Then the war would end, and the borders would open for food and medical care, and nobody would die. But it's all in Hamas's hands, and Hamas has refused to accept the Israel and American offer they had originally accepted, and they changed their mind. Why'd they change their mind? Because France said they would recognize a Palestinian state. And if France and England are going to recognize a Palestinian state without Hamas doing anything, why should Hamas do anything? So it's not going to do anything. And it's going to be the fault of Great Britain and France. All right, let's turn to domestic matters, horrible domestic matters, the killing on Park Avenue in New York. I live around the corner from there. I pass that building, I don't know, 2-3 times a week. It's a beautiful building. It has some great companies in it, including the National Football League, including Blackstone and other financial and commercial ventures. And apparently, we don't know the facts, but according to Jessica Tisch, who is the police commissioner, my former research assistant, former student, and a really brilliant woman, maybe, and according to Adams, the mayor of New York, maybe he was coming to target the National Football League. We know he was a football player, and that maybe he was injured, and maybe he had some brain issues. And so the question everybody asks, whenever you have a tragedy like this, where you have a security officer killed, a man who came to this country, has a wife, 2 children, one on the way. What a tragic death. Another young woman graduated college and started to work, and she's gunned down in the prime of her life. Just terrible. And it was done by a man who probably is mentally ill. That's not an excuse, but it raises the question about whether this could have been prevented. Now, you all know I've written this book called The Preventive State, and I deal extensively with this problem in the preventive state. I deal with it in several chapters and in several different ways. Number one, I started writing The Preventive State when there were close to 1 million people in mental hospitals around the country locked up. We preventively detained mentally ill people on the theory that if they were allowed to be loose, they would hurt other people. And then that changed, particularly under then Governor Reagan. Ronald Reagan became president. He decided no longer to keep mentally ill people all housed in institutions. He did it partly on civil liberties grounds, partly on financial grounds. It was costing California a fortune. And so he did what Americans generally do. He overreacted. Instead of letting out only the non-dangerous ones on a selective basis after tests, etc., he basically let everybody out. We saw what happened. The streets of San Francisco and Los Angeles were filled with mentally ill people who became homeless, and some committed crimes. Most didn't. But most just became difficult. And, we saw it on the subway of New York. when this mentally ill person started screaming and yelling, and eventually a young Marine grabbed him, and he died, and the Marine was charged with homicide, ultimately acquitted by a wise jury, because what the Marine did was just perfectly reasonable under the circumstances. But so we have that one issue. The issue is, should we go back? We shouldn't go back, but should we strike a different balance? And should we perhaps start detaining and confining people who are diagnosed as very dangerous and likely to go out and kill people? Now, we're not very good at predicting. And if we were to have locked up this guy based on the criteria that he's satisfied, we'd probably be locking up also a lot of people who didn't commit any serious crimes, who wouldn't have committed any serious crimes. So we have to be very careful. We confined too many back in the 50s and 60s, and perhaps we confine too few now. How to strike the appropriate balance, how to avoid too many false positives, and at the same time avoiding false negatives, is a very, very hard question. I pose it in my book, The Preventive State, both in general and in the context of presidential assassinations, because could we have predicted what the two assassins might have done? Which brings us to the related issue of both presidential assassins. Both of them had guns, and we have what are known as red flag laws. Chapter in my book, The Preventive State, on red flag laws. Red flag laws don't lock people up, but they say, look, if there are enough red flags, if there's enough criteria, enough diagnosis, enough evidence of mental instability, well, we're not going to lock you up, but we're not going to give you a gun. We're not going to let you get a gun. We're going to take away your gun if you have it. And there's been big dispute about that. And there have been a lot of red flag gun deprivations accepted by the courts, because the courts always want to err on the side of safety. Nobody wants to be in tomorrow's headline, judge allowed so-and-so to have a gun which he used to kill 12 people. Nobody wants that. If you take a gun away from them, it's unlikely that will be a headline story. So judges have been taking away the guns. Now, some Second Amendment people have been saying, no, too many guns are being taken away in the name of red flag laws. And we have to analyze that. Freedom is different than guns. And that is, locking somebody up based on a prediction is far more serious than taking away his gun. Now, for some people, life without a gun is not life at all. So you might as well be locked up. Those are extremists, I think. But we do have a Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is part of the Constitution, which talks about life, liberty. So liberty is in there as well. And so you have, on the one hand, taking away somebody's liberty, and on the other hand, somebody's Second Amendment right to bear arms. And so that issue has to be considered very seriously when we balance liberty against deprivations of liberty, whether the deprivation of liberty takes the form of total confinement or it takes the form of just taking away guns. My own feeling is we can do more on both scores. I think we can take away more guns of people like this guy, who never should have been able to get a gun license. He had a history of mental illness, a history of brain issues, and a history of, I'm sure, grievances that could have been known before he was able to get a gun. Now, he got the gun in Nevada, and he got in his car, and this guy was determined. He drove as far as we know, from Las Vegas, Nevada. He drove all the way to New York City. And, we live under a constitution that doesn't permit you to create state borders. And so there's nothing that could have been done to stop this guy from coming into New York with his gun. Now, the gun he had in New York was illegal in New York. He didn't have the right to have that gun in New York. But we don't search people coming over the George Washington Bridge or through the Holland and Lincoln tunnels. They just have freedom to come in, and if you have a car, to bring whatever you need to bring in, whether it be drugs or guns or knives or anything else. And so, our Constitution imposes restrictions on what we can do and what we can't do. And anytime there's a crime like this, the first instinct, and it's why I wrote my book, The Preventive State, the first instinct is we could have prevented this if only, we had done this or done that. And that's true. But if you've done this and done that to everybody who was like this guy, there'd be lots and lots of people confined in mental hospitals and lots of people whose guns were taken away. Maybe that's okay. That was the way it was in the 1960s, and we did have fewer crimes. Now, it was announced today that you don't have to worry about this guy anymore because it's a lone wolf. He did it alone. Now, there's some investigations suggesting he may have been in touch with some people. We don't know. We'll find that out, obviously, over time as we see more investigation of his computers, of his phone, and everything like that. The one thing that makes me a little nervous, being a New Yorker, is that we have now two cases. Maybe we have more that we don't really focus on or don't know about. Two cases of people who came to New York to kill prominent people who represented an industry that they disapproved of. You remember the first case where this young man stalked the head of the health services company and then shot him in the back in cold blood because he was upset at the way the company handled health claims, etc. And the company was in New York, where so many companies are. And this guy now apparently killed because he came to New York to kill people at the National Football League. He got on the wrong elevator and he killed somebody who had nothing to do with it. And he also, as I say, killed the security guard with the family. It's just horrible, horrible story. So what I worry about is New York becoming a kind of magnet for the kind of killers with a cause. Killers with a cause. Remember the movie Rebel Without a Cause? These are killers with a cause. Killers who focus on somebody. Now, there's no evidence that the guy who's still alive from the health shooting was mentally ill. There's no evidence of that. We don't know. We'll see. More evidence will probably come out. There is evidence that this guy from the second killing was at least had serious mental problems. We don't know what the diagnosis would have been or whether the diagnosis would have permitted a psychiatrist to make a prediction. We do know that psychiatrists historically have not been particularly good at making predictions. They tend to overpredict, sometimes underpredict. Psychiatrists have an obligation under what's called the Tarasov case. If somebody comes and speaks to a psychiatrist seeking help and the person reveals information that makes it likely that he would either kill himself or kill or seriously harm somebody else, under the Tarasov decision, the psychiatrist, psychologist as well, and other professionals would have an obligation to turn his patient in. By the way, that's not necessarily true of lawyers. If a person comes, or priests is the easiest one. If a person comes to, and this may sound awful and counterintuitive, but I know it's true because I've checked it with canon lawyers, and I've had canon lawyers come to my class and talk about this. If a penitent comes to a priest, I'm talking about a Catholic priest now because different religions have different rules. If comes to a Catholic priest and says, I want to confess in advance because I'm about to go and kill my wife, I think every priest I know would do something, but they're not supposed to. They're not supposed to turn the person in. I know what I would do if I was a priest. I would hold the guy if I was big enough and he was small enough, and I would physically constrain him and prevent him from doing it. I don't know if I would have a lawful authority if the police came in and said, "Why are you doing this?" I wouldn't be allowed to say under the rules of canon law, "Well, he just told me that he's going to kill his wife." So the Catholic priest is in the most extreme position, and there have been cases where priests have had confessions made. They haven't said anything, and the person has gone out and done some pretty awful things. The priest's allowed to say to the person, by the way, if you do kill your wife, you will be damned eternally to hell, and this will happen to you, and it'll be terrible, 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 terrible. But you can't drop a dime on him. Lawyers used to be able to say, we're not allowed to testify. We can't do it. But recently, there have been some changes in the Bar Association rules. And now, if you learn information from a client that makes it likely that he will hurt somebody very seriously, kill or seriously injure, um, maybe you do then have permission, maybe even an obligation to turn that person in. The traditional rule for lawyers is no, you don't. The traditional rule for psychiatrists was the same, but it was changed in the Tarasov decision. And so psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health workers now have the greatest obligation to the public, priests, the least obligation to the public, lawyers somewhere in between, closer to the priest than to the other side. So we have no indication that this guy indicated to anybody that he was going to do this. Obviously, if you're a lay person, the guy comes to you and says, I'm about to head to New York to kill some people, you have no obligation of secrecy. You should turn him in. In fact, under the law of some jurisdictions, maybe you have to turn him in. And other jurisdictions, remaining silent is probably permissible, but it's wrong ethically and morally. So we'll wait and see. But I suspect we're going to see legislation that expands red flag laws so as to make it harder for a guy like him to get the kind of gun he got. And by the way, although it's apparently classified for some weird reason as a pistol, obviously it's a long barrel, and it had I don't know much about guns, but it had magazines and a capability of shooting quite a few rounds in a short period of time. So there are things that could be done in terms of guns, denying accessibility to guns. There are things that could be done, but disputed whether it should be done, about people like him being confined in institutions against their will until they are no longer a danger to themselves or others. We'll see if there's any legislation. What happens often is cases like this provoke legislation, or at least they provoke hearings and some discussion, and sometimes you get legislation, sometimes you don't. The bottom line is it's very unlikely this could have been prevented within existing law, and the tragedy is that people were killed. Could it have been prevented by greater security at the building? More difficulty in getting up elevators? These are all issues that I'm sure the security people in the building and in the city of New York will be considering. But there's no simple solution to the problem of how to prevent crimes like this without impinging on the civil liberties of people who would never be guilty of such crimes. That's what I write about in Preventive State: false positives, false negatives, how to strike the appropriate balance. And we're going to be keeping debating this issue as long as human beings are fallible, and as long as they commit crimes, and as long as others think that they can be stopped from committing crimes. So interested in having your views on this. Speaking of your views, let's turn now to some really interesting letters. I agree with everything you say. However, when you said that the USA committed genocide in Dresden and Hiroshima, that is not relevant, as genocide was coined post-World War II. It may not be relevant legally, but it is certainly relevant morally. Even if there was no term genocide, we know what it meant. I mean, the reason the term became in use is because what the Germans did to the Jews was clearly something that deserved the label genocide. You might have a different name. Genocide is an interesting combination of two words: gene, race, all of that, side, killing. But we knew it was wrong. We knew it was a horrible thing, whether we had the word or not. So I don't agree with you. My point is that what Israel is accused of, without regard to words, the United States and Great Britain did far worse. And so be careful about who's making the accusation. Thanks for the clarity. If the world were really interested in starving Gazans, all that would be, if the world were really interested in Gazans who are starving, I read that right, but it was all that is needed is for Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar to take in their Arab brethren, the women and children in Gaza. It is a campaign, unfortunately, supported by the UN, the UK, and European countries to delegitimize the state of Israel and end the war with Hamas victory. The Hamas executive terrorists are living a life of luxury in Qatar. The starving and mistreated in Gaza are the Israeli hostages. So, look, there's no question that Hamas is winning the public relations war, and they're winning it because the media is rewarding Hamas for its tactic of incentivizing the killing of its civilians, or even denying of food to its civilians by stealing the food, and then getting the New York Times, CNN, and others to tell one side of the story. So it's true. Hamas is responsible for any famine in Gaza. All they have to do is release all the hostages they took in October and surrender to Israel or even to a neutral third party. Hamas could end this war tomorrow by doing those two things. True. This is one about what I talked about in regard to being a pedophile. I work in the sphere of finding the pedo traffickers. We don't pull stupid stunts by trapping some guy who's trying to hook up with a teenager. That's not pedophilia. We hunt the people trafficking prepubescent children. This Epstein issue and all those clickbaits, YouTube videos generally distract and water down what the real crime is, crimes against real children, etc. He's right about that. When we promiscuously throw around the term pedophile and trafficking, we're weakening the power of those words, and those words should be directed at real pedophiles and real traffickers instead of somebody who is an obvious target of conspiracy theories, and both parties are using him for political purposes. Okay. I appreciate your concern with being precise with words. And yes, he may not be a pedophile, according to the DSM-5, but there is evidence that some of his victims were as young as 14, which could put him in the category of, I never heard this word before, but hebephilic, which is the word for attraction to mid-teenage children. But even pedophilic's range depends on physical development. Look, the point is, his attraction was primarily to the 16 and 17-year-olds. The only people he pleaded guilty to were 17 and a half and 18. So there is no evidence that I'm aware of his having any sexual contact with anybody near the age of 12 or 13. And I don't know what the evidence is of 14, but I remain to be persuaded that it was an appropriate phrase. I don't think so. Okay. Thank you. And yes, you're absolutely right. This is exactly what Orwell was talking about. When people play with words, if you don't like what the definition of genocide is, just make up a new definition to fit in your prejudice. Thank you so much. And yes. Thanks for your clarity. If the world were really interested, okay, I read that one already. And this is the final one. This is a PR battle that Israel is losing. That's absolutely true. The need to drastically up their game, the need to provide direct evidence that discredits Hamas lies, nothing else will be effective. Maybe every IDF soldier should carry a video camera and video everything they do. Provide this kind of proof often enough, and the world at large will no longer give any credence to Hamas claims. Israel can't rely on he said, she said, or courtroom type arguments. Thinking they will shows a lack of understanding of the principles of information warfare. I completely agree with you. Where I disagree is I don't think people care about the evidence. There is evidence. We've seen evidence. We've seen evidence when in the beginning, when people said there was starvation, we saw markets filled with fruits and vegetables. Even yesterday, I saw a market filled with fruits and vegetables. So there may be a problem of distribution of how the food is getting to the right places, but Israel has sent hundreds of trucks filled with food and medicine, and they've crossed the border into Gaza. Now they're the responsibility of the UN and the responsibility of Gazan authorities. But the idea that it's Israel that's using starvation as a weapon of war, there's just no real evidence of that. And I'm surprised that President Trump, who usually has a lot of common sense about how the media can be used to be weaponized, hasn't taken a stronger line on look at the evidence. And yeah, you see hungry children, and it's terrible. Nobody ever wants to see a child with a bloated belly. But the question is, who's responsible? And that's the issue that I think we all have to face. Who's responsible and who can stop it? And the answer to that is Hamas on both scores. See you tomorrow.